July 23, 1943. Beneath the sweltering heat of the Philippine sun, Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Nakamura stood in the Imperial Engineering Depot near Manila, watching as his team of metallurgists examined the latest American Sherman tank tracks captured during operations in the South Pacific. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he observed the careful measurements being taken. The engineers were certain these components would reveal critical flaws they could exploit in future encounters. Little did they know, this examination would lead them to question everything they understood about industrial capability and national pride. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a routine analysis of enemy equipment would evolve into a profound realization about the fundamental differences between Japanese and American industrial philosophy, a revelation that would challenge the deepest convictions of some of Japan's finest scientific minds, and expose the true nature of the industrial gap between the two nations at war. The original order came directly from Imperial headquarters in Tokyo. Major General Toshiro Yamamoto of the Technical Research Division had demanded a comprehensive analysis of all captured American equipment. "Our forces continue to encounter these Sherman tanks throughout the Pacific Theater," he had written in his directive. "Despite our superior tactics, we must understand why their machinery sometimes withstands conditions that disable our own." Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura had been selected to lead this investigation for good reason. With a doctorate in metallurgical engineering from Tokyo Imperial University and 5 years of experience at Nippon Steel before being drafted into military service, he represented the pinnacle of Japanese technical expertise. His team included Professor Kenji Tanaka, formerly of Kyoto Imperial University, Sergeant Ichiro Sato, who had worked as a senior quality inspector at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries tank production facility, and Corporal Masao Watanabe, a gifted young engineer who had shown remarkable aptitude for materials science. "Begin with the tracks," Nakamura instructed his team. "Our Type 97 Chiha medium tanks consistently report track failures in jungle conditions. The Americans seem not to have this problem." Professor Tanaka nodded, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "We shall perform microscopic analysis of the steel composition first, followed by stress testing to replicate battlefield conditions." Their workshop had been set up in what was once a commercial garage, now repurposed for military research. The tropical humidity caused test equipment to malfunction regularly, and keeping precise measurements required constant recalibration. The captured Sherman tracks had arrived 3 days earlier, transported under heavy guard from a battlefield on Luzon, where American forces had temporarily withdrawn, leaving behind damaged equipment. Sergeant Sato had already begun preliminary measurements. "The American tracks are 7 centimeters wider than our standard issues," he reported, "and each link weighs approximately 2.4 kilograms more than ours. This seems inefficient." "Perhaps," Nakamura replied, "but let us not jump to conclusions. Efficiency must be measured against performance." On the American side, the tank tracks being studied had been manufactured at the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan. Chief Engineer Robert Williams had overseen their production as part of the massive industrial mobilization that transformed America's peacetime economy into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. "These tracks are built to take a beating," Williams had told his production team in 1942. "When our boys are fighting halfway across the world, they cannot afford to wait for replacement parts. We build them tough the first time." The Detroit Tank Arsenal was producing more than 500 tanks monthly. Its vast assembly lines employed over 5,000 workers, including many women who had replaced men now serving overseas. The facility covered over 1 million square feet and operated around the clock 7 days a week. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, Corporal Watanabe had been tasked with conducting the initial hardness tests on the American tank tracks. Using a portable Rockwell testing device, he methodically worked his way across different sections of the captured equipment. "Sir, I believe there may be an error in my measurements," Watanabe reported to Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura on the second day. "The hardness readings are inconsistent with our expectations." "Explain," Nakamura said, looking up from his paperwork. "The American track shows unusually high molybdenum content based on our spectroscopic analysis, and the hardness patterns are peculiar. The outer surface is extremely hard, measuring between 58 and 62 on the Rockwell C scale, while the inner core reads much lower, around 30 to 35. Professor Tanaka joined the conversation. His interest piqued. "That suggests case hardening, a technique where only the outer layer of steel is carbonized. But why would they do this? Our approach achieves uniform hardness throughout." Nakamura considered this information. "Perhaps a manufacturing shortcut. Continue your analysis. I want stress tests beginning tomorrow." The Japanese team was operating under severe constraints. The war situation was increasingly dire, with American forces advancing island by island across the Pacific. Fuel shortages meant electricity was unreliable, and their testing equipment was largely outdated. Nevertheless, they proceeded with professional thoroughness. The Japanese metallurgists had been trained in the German tradition of engineering, precise, methodical, and with great emphasis on theoretical perfection. Japanese military doctrine valued the spiritual strength of its warriors above material factors, an approach that influenced even their scientific endeavors. Their tanks were designed with lightweight tracks to conserve scarce steel and improve fuel efficiency, reflecting the resource limitations of their island nation. By contrast, American engineering philosophy emphasized pragmatic solutions, mass production, and material abundance. The Sherman tank was not the best in any single category, but was designed to be manufactured quickly, operated reliably, and repaired easily. As Sergeant Sato prepared the stress testing apparatus, he reflected on his experience at Mitsubishi. "We were always told to conserve materials," he told Corporal Watanabe. "Every gram of steel saved was considered a victory for the Emperor." "The Americans clearly do not share this concern," Watanabe replied, gesturing toward the hefty Sherman track links arranged on their workbench. The next morning, the team gathered to begin stress testing. They had devised an apparatus that would apply pressure and flexion to the track links while simultaneously subjecting them to abrasive materials, sand, volcanic soil, and mud, collected from various battle sites in the Philippines. Professor Tanaka had calculated the theoretical breaking points of both Japanese and American tracks based on their composition and structure. "According to my calculations, our tracks should fail at around 8,000 cycles under these conditions, while the American tracks should withstand perhaps 20% more due to their additional mass." Nakamura nodded. "Let us begin and see if reality matches theory." The testing proceeded day and night. The team worked in shifts, with one member always monitoring the apparatus. The monotonous sound of the machine, a repetitive clank followed by the hiss of hydraulics, became the background music of their lives. On July 27th, after 4 days of continuous testing, Sergeant Sato reported the first results with evident confusion. "Sir, we have reached 20,000 cycles on the American track sample, and it shows minimal wear. This exceeds our projections by over 100%. Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura frowned. "Check your equipment. There must be a calibration error." "I have verified twice, sir. The readings are accurate." Professor Tanaka interjected. "Perhaps we should run a control test with one of our own track links to establish a baseline comparison." This suggestion proved pivotal. A Type 97 Chiha track link was obtained from a maintenance depot and subjected to identical testing conditions. The results were disturbing. "Our track failed at 7,822 cycles," Watanabe reported, checking his meticulous notes. "Almost exactly as Professor Tanaka predicted, but the American track has now exceeded 25,000 cycles and continues to function." The implications hung in the air, unspoken but evident to all. If these results were accurate, American tanks could operate more than 3 times longer without track replacement, a significant tactical advantage in extended campaigns. "We must dissect the American track completely," Nakamura decided. "There must be an explanation beyond mere material quantity." As July turned to August, the team descended deeper into their analysis. They cut cross-sections of the American tracks, examined them under microscopes, and conducted further chemical analyses. What they discovered challenged their fundamental understanding of metallurgical science. The Americans are using a dual-phase steel manufacturing process, Professor Tanaka explained during their evening briefing, pointing to microscope photographs. The outer case is indeed hardened to resist abrasion, but the inner core remains relatively ductile to absorb shock without cracking. But this is inefficient, protested Sergeant Sato. It requires additional processing steps and consumes more energy during manufacturing. Yes, agreed Tanaka, but it produces a superior product that lasts significantly longer in field conditions. As their investigation continued, they discovered another surprising feature. The American tracks contained precise amounts of vanadium and nickel, alloy elements that were strictly rationed in Japan due to their scarcity. Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura's reports to Tokyo became increasingly concerning. The American approach to materials science appears fundamentally different from ours, he wrote. They utilize abundant raw materials and complex manufacturing processes to achieve longevity rather than initial efficiency. This philosophy extends beyond their tank tracks and may explain the durability advantages observed in other equipment. In Tokyo, these reports generated significant alarm. Major General Yamamoto convened a special committee of industrial leaders and military planners to address the implications. The committee included representatives from Nippon Steel, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and the Army Technical Bureau. If Nakamura's findings are accurate, Yamamoto told the committee, we must reconsider our entire approach to weapons production. The Americans are not just outproducing us, they are creating equipment that outlasts ours by factors of 3 to 10. Hajime Sugiyama, the Minister of War, received a summarized version of these findings. His response was less scientific and more philosophical. Superior spirit will overcome superior material, he reportedly stated. One Japanese warrior is worth 10 American machines. This spiritual perspective, while inspiring, did little to solve the practical problems faced by Japanese forces in the field. Tank crews continued to struggle with track failures that immobilized their vehicles at critical moments. Back in the Philippines, the research team expanded their investigation to include additional components of the Sherman tank. They examined the suspension system, drive sprockets, and even the quality of bolts and fasteners. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of the same philosophy. Materials selected for durability rather than initial cost, designs optimized for longevity in harsh conditions, and manufacturing processes that prioritized reliability over theoretical efficiency. As their research progressed, an unexpected development occurred. On August 12th, their facility received a visitor, Captain William Parker, an American intelligence officer who had been captured during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong. He was being temporarily held at their facility before transfer to a permanent prisoner camp. Normally, interaction between Japanese researchers and American prisoners would have been strictly forbidden. However, Captain Parker had been an engineer at the Chrysler Corporation before the war, working specifically on tank production. When this information emerged during his initial interrogation, Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura made an unusual request to question the prisoner about American manufacturing techniques. The interrogation took place in a small office adjacent to the workshop. Captain Parker, despite his circumstances, maintained a professional demeanor. He understood that discussing general manufacturing processes would not compromise specific military secrets. Your tanks waste materials, Sergeant Sato stated, opening the conversation confrontationally. We have calculated that each track assembly uses 30% more steel than necessary. Parker smiled slightly. Necessary for what purpose? If you mean necessary to leave the factory, you're right. But if you mean necessary to complete a 12-month deployment in the field under combat conditions, you're wrong. This response captured the essence of the philosophical difference. The Japanese engineers designed to minimize initial resource consumption. The Americans designed to minimize lifetime resource consumption, including maintenance and replacement. How many man-hours does your country devote to track replacement in the field? Parker asked. The Japanese team exchanged glances. This metric, the total system cost including maintenance, had not been part of their efficiency calculations. Professor Tanaka posed a more technical question. We have observed case-hardened surfaces with ductile cores in your track links. This process requires additional manufacturing steps. How did your factories achieve this at your production volumes? Automation, Parker replied simply. Our heat treatment processes are largely mechanized. One operator can process hundreds of track links per day. The concept of extensively automated production lines was not foreign to the Japanese engineers in theory, but the scale described by Parker was beyond their industrial reality. Japan's manufacturing still relied heavily on skilled craftsmen performing multiple steps, while American industry had embraced specialization and mechanization to a far greater extent. This conversation, though brief, provided context for the team's physical findings. The Americans weren't just using different materials, they were operating from an entirely different industrial paradigm. Following this encounter, Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura authored his most comprehensive report yet, titled Fundamental Disparities in Industrial Philosophy Between Imperial Japan and the United States. In it, he outlined not just the technical differences they had observed, but the underlying philosophical gap. The Americans operate from a position of material abundance we can scarcely comprehend, he wrote. Their approach to manufacturing accepts higher initial resource consumption to achieve lower lifetime resource requirements. This is not merely a technical choice, but reflects their national character, a preference for immediate strength over elegant efficiency. He continued with a passage that particularly alarmed Tokyo. We have calculated that a single American Sherman tank can remain operational in jungle conditions approximately 3 times longer than our Type 97 before requiring major track overhaul. This translates directly to increased operational availability, a force multiplier that effectively triples their deployed strength without requiring additional units. Nakamura's report reached Tokyo in early September 1943. By this time, the strategic situation in the Pacific had deteriorated further for Japan. American forces were advancing in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and elsewhere. Industrial production was struggling under increasingly effective bombing campaigns. The response from Imperial headquarters was not what Nakamura had hoped for. Rather than addressing the fundamental issues he had identified, the High Command issued new directives focusing on spiritual factors. Japanese warriors must overcome material disadvantages through superior spirit and fighting techniques. Technical personnel should focus on immediate improvements achievable within current resource constraints. This response reflected the military leadership's inability to address core industrial disparities. Japan simply lacked the raw materials, manufacturing infrastructure, and energy resources to adopt American production philosophies, even if they had wanted to. In the Philippines, Nakamura's team continued their research despite the limited impact of their findings on national policy. They developed modest improvements to the Japanese track design, incorporating some of the principles they had observed in the American version while working within severe material constraints. We cannot match their alloy composition, Professor Tanaka acknowledged during a design meeting, but we can adopt their dual hardness approach to some extent, using differential heat treatment processes. By October, they had produced prototype tracks that showed approximately 40% improvement in longevity compared to the standard issue. This was far short of matching American performance, but represented a meaningful enhancement given their constraints. Meanwhile, on the American side, production continued to accelerate. The Detroit tank arsenal and other facilities were now producing tanks faster than they could be transported to war zones. By late 1943, American monthly tank production exceeded Japan's annual output. This quantitative advantage compounded the qualitative advantages Nakamura's team had identified. Robert Williams, the chief engineer at Detroit, continued refining his designs based on field feedback. Each tank that comes back for repairs tells us a story, he told his team. Our job is to listen to those stories and make the next tanks better. This approach to continuous improvement, fueled by abundant data from the field and supported by virtually unlimited resources, created a cycle of advancement that Japan could not match. American tanks were not only more numerous, but were evolving more rapidly based on combat experience. In November 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura received orders to return to Japan with his research team. The deteriorating situation in the Philippines made continued work there increasingly untenable. They packed their equipment, reports, and samples, including sections of the American tank tracks that had sparked their investigation. Their journey home proved perilous. The ship carrying them from Manila encountered an American submarine patrol. Although they eventually reached Yokohama safely, several crates of their research materials were lost when a support vessel was sunk. Upon returning to Japan, Nakamura and his team were reassigned to various defense projects. Professor Tanaka joined a research group working on metallurgical improvements for aircraft engines. Sergeant Sato returned to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, where he attempted to implement some of the lessons learned from American tank tracks. Corporal Watanabe, the youngest team member, perhaps made the most significant long-term impact. After the war, he would become a leading figure in Japan's industrial resurrection, applying the painful lessons from his wartime research to help Japanese manufacturing evolve into a global powerhouse. In December 1943, Nakamura submitted his final report on the tank track investigation. This document was more philosophical than technical, addressing the broader implications of what they had discovered. The gap we face is not merely one of current production capacity, which might be overcome through greater effort or sacrifice, he wrote. Rather, it is a fundamental disparity in industrial approach born of different national circumstances. The Americans design from abundance. We design from scarcity. Until this fundamental condition changes, the qualitative difference in our equipment will persist regardless of the spirit of our warriors. He concluded with a passage that would prove eerily prophetic. A nation's war potential in the modern age is inseparable from its industrial philosophy. Future conflicts will be won, not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor, perhaps years before the first shot is fired. This report was read by select members of the Imperial High Command, but had little immediate impact on Japan's wartime strategy. The militarist government remained committed to its existing approach, believing that spiritual factors could overcome material disadvantages. As 1944 progressed, the material disparities identified by Nakamura's team became increasingly evident on battlefields throughout the Pacific. Japanese tanks, with their lighter tracks and less durable components, frequently broke down during operations. American Sherman tanks, though not the most powerful tanks of the war, proved remarkably reliable in tropical conditions. Colonel James Wilson, commanding the 617th Tank Battalion in the Philippines campaign, noted in his after-action report, "Our vehicles consistently outperformed the enemy's in terms of operational availability, while Japanese tanks showed comparable or superior mobility when functioning. They frequently became immobilized due to mechanical failures, particularly track separations." This observation precisely validated Nakamura's findings from a year earlier. The theoretical advantage of Japan's lighter, more fuel-efficient tanks was negated by their practical disadvantage in durability and reliability. By early 1945, as American forces landed on Iwo Jima and prepared to assault Okinawa, the industrial disparity had grown to overwhelming proportions. American factories had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks, while Japan had built approximately 2,500 tanks of all types during the entire war. Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura, now working at a research facility near Nagoya, watched these developments with resignation. The technical gaps he had identified in 1943 had only widened. American equipment was now arriving in theater, not just in greater quantities, but in improved versions that incorporated lessons from battlefield experience. In March 1945, as American bombers increasingly targeted Japan's mainland industrial facilities, Nakamura wrote a private letter to Professor Tanaka, who had relocated to Kyoto. "Our investigation of those American tank tracks now seems like a message from the future," he wrote. "We glimpsed the true nature of modern industrial warfare, a contest of systems rather than men, of philosophies rather than tactics. The spiritual strength of our nation remains undiminished, but against the material tide we now face, such strength alone cannot prevail." After the war, the insights gained by Nakamura and his team would contribute to Japan's industrial resurrection. The lessons learned from American manufacturing philosophy, designing for durability, automating production processes, and considering lifetime costs rather than initial efficiency became core principles of Japan's post-war industrial strategy. Ironically, by the 1970s, these principles had evolved further in Japanese hands. Companies like Toyota pioneered new approaches that combined the durability focus they had learned from America with the resource efficiency that had been necessary during wartime. The resulting manufacturing philosophy, emphasizing quality, durability, and efficiency simultaneously, would eventually challenge American industrial dominance. Corporal Watanabe, the young engineer who had first noticed the unusual hardness patterns in the American tank tracks, became Dr. Masao Watanabe, a professor of materials science at Tokyo University and advisor to several major Japanese corporations. In a 1978 interview about Japan's industrial development, he reflected on his wartime experience. What we discovered in that hot workshop in Manila was not just a better tank track, but a different way of thinking about industrial production. The Americans showed us that true efficiency is measured across the entire lifetime of a product, not merely in its initial creation. This lesson, learned at great cost during the conflict, became one of the foundation stones upon which modern Japan was built. Robert Williams, the chief engineer from the Detroit Tank Arsenal, also had a distinguished post-war career. He worked on automotive design at General Motors until his retirement in 1967. When asked about the secret to the Sherman tank's famous reliability, he gave a characteristically straightforward answer. "We built them like we built our cars, to keep running regardless of how they were treated. We knew our boys would be operating them in conditions we could barely imagine, so we designed for the worst case. It was not about making the theoretical best tank on paper. It was about making tanks that would still be running after everything else had broken down." This pragmatic philosophy, prioritizing real-world performance over theoretical efficiency, had proven decisive during the war. The Sherman was never the most powerful or technically advanced tank, but it was available in overwhelming numbers and crucially remained operational in conditions that disabled more sophisticated designs. The story of Nakamura's tank track investigation represents a microcosm of the larger industrial contest that underpinned World War II. Beyond the battles and campaigns that fill history, books lay this other war, the war of production philosophy, material science, and industrial capacity. In this less visible but ultimately decisive contest, the outcome was determined not by tactics or courage, but by fundamental approaches to manufacturing and resource utilization. The American tank tracks that lasted 10 times longer than their Japanese counterparts symbolized more than superior metallurgy. They represented an industrial system optimized for different priorities. The Japanese approach prioritized initial efficiency and minimal resource usage. The American approach accepted higher initial costs to achieve greater long-term performance. In the final analysis, both approaches reflected national circumstances. Japan, with limited domestic resources, necessarily emphasized conservation and efficiency. America, blessed with abundant raw materials and energy, could afford to prioritize durability and overwhelming production volume. The technical gap identified by Nakamura's team in that Philippine workshop was never merely a matter of better steel or more advanced manufacturing techniques. It reflected deeper differences in industrial philosophy, resource availability, and national circumstances. Understanding this truth came too late to influence the war's outcome, but the lessons learned would help shape the post-war world. Today, the integration of these once opposing philosophies, American emphasis on durability and performance with Japanese focus on efficiency and precision, forms the foundation of modern global manufacturing. The fierce competitors of World War II ultimately became teachers and students to each other, creating industrial approaches that drew from both traditions. The Sherman tank tracks that so impressed Nakamura's team now rest in museums, artifacts of a conflict long past. Yet the industrial philosophies they embodied continue to evolve and compete in the global marketplace. The war of factories and production methods never truly ended. It merely transformed into economic competition that continues to this day. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.